Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a powerful journey of betrayal, resilience, and triumph. Imagine discovering your partner's deception through a single text message, only to find yourself standing strong and moving forward with determination. This is the story of a woman who, after being blindsided by her husband's cruel departure, took control of her life, protecting her dreams and her business. What followed was not just survival, but an inspiring transformation. Join us as we dive into a story of strength, independence, and the power of starting over. Subscribe now to begin today's story. I had always prided myself on being calm under pressure. It was something my friends and family often remarked about me, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment I received that text message. It arrived while I was helping a customer at my boutique. I was carefully arranging a new scarf for Mrs. Wilson, one of my regulars, when I saw the notification light up on my phone. The message was from Brad, my husband of 12 years. "I'm leaving you. I'm moving to Miami with Jessica, my 20-year-old girlfriend. I've already emptied our joint account." Haha. For a second, everything around me stood still. The sound of Mrs. Wilson chatting with me faded. The air seemed thicker, and I felt my heart beat harder in my chest. But I didn't show it. I didn't let my voice falter as I helped her pick out the perfect scarf. The only sign that the man I had spent over a decade of my life with had just destroyed everything was the slight tightening around my eyes. I stayed focused on Mrs. Wilson, maintaining the polite smile I always wore, even as my mind raced. I told myself I had to finish the transaction before I let myself feel anything. My hands didn't shake as I wrapped the scarf in silver paper, something I had perfected over years of running my own boutique. Once Mrs. Wilson left, I locked up the shop and sat at my desk. The calmness of the shop, with its soft lighting and the soft hum of the air conditioning, contrasted with the storm raging inside my head. "I'm leaving you. I've emptied our joint account." His words echoed in my ears like a cruel joke. But it was no joke. Brad was serious. And yet, I didn't feel the intense anger or sadness that I thought I would. Maybe it was because I had seen the signs. There had been hints for months. His late nights at the office that never seemed to match up with the deposits in his paycheck. His sudden obsession with going to the gym and buying new clothes. Trying to recapture the youth he seemed to think he had lost. I had noticed the changes in him long before this text. 3 months ago, I had found a receipt for a dinner for two at a fancy restaurant on a night he claimed he was working late. That was when I knew I had to start protecting myself. I had already opened a separate bank account at a different bank a week before Brad suggested that we combine our accounts to make things easier. I had agreed to that. Cheerful on the surface, but in reality, I had quietly moved my personal savings into the new account. The joint account he emptied had just enough money to keep him from getting suspicious. It was enough to make it seem like everything was normal. The rest was safely hidden in my new account, along with detailed records of every suspicious transaction Brad had made over the past year. When my phone buzzed again, I knew exactly what it was. Another text from him. "Don't bother begging. Jessica and I leave for Miami tomorrow. I'll send for my things later." The reality of the situation sank in even deeper. But this time, I didn't feel the familiar sting of betrayal. If anything, I felt more resolute. Jessica was the new receptionist at his office. A young woman he had introduced to me at a Christmas party a year ago. I had noticed the way she laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. How she would touch his arm when she thought no one was looking. She was young enough to be his daughter. Naive enough to think that she was special. She wasn't. She was just the latest in a long line of distractions for him. I didn't respond to his text. Instead, I called my lawyer. I had been preparing for this moment for a while. Ever since I had found those hotel charges on our credit card statement 3 months ago. I had known something was coming. And I had made sure I was ready. My lawyer had already helped me put together the necessary documents and had given me advice on how to protect my assets. "It's time," I said simply, after a brief exchange with the lawyer. I knew what I had to do. The papers were ready, and all I needed was for Brad to make the first move. And he had. Good luck. I added in my mind, knowing exactly what was coming. Brad probably thought I was devastated, imagining me sitting in tears over his betrayal. Maybe he even thought I would beg for him to stay. But I didn't. I was calm, collected, and resolute, while he glowed over his grand exit. I went about my day like everything was normal. I took the next few hours to gather all the paperwork I needed, reviewing everything one last time to ensure I had covered my tracks. As I worked through the files, I found our wedding album. It was strange to look at it now. Brad looked so different then. Before his midlife crisis had turned him into the man I barely recognized. He was still attractive, but somewhere along the way, his insecurities had eaten him up, and he was now trying to reclaim a youth that had long passed. I smiled bitterly as I thought of the certified letters that would greet him in Miami. He would find out soon enough how thoroughly I had prepared. I wasn't going to let him walk away with a penny of what was mine. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about protecting everything I had worked for. I spent the evening at the house, going through paperwork that I would need for the next steps. It was strange, being alone in our house, the house I had inherited from my grandmother and always kept in my name despite Brad's repeated suggestions to add him to the deed. Another piece of foresight that had paid off. I had made sure everything was in order, just in case. It wasn't the first time I had to remind myself that I could handle this on my own. It wasn't the first time I realized that I had built my life up on my own terms. Tomorrow, Brad would learn the hard way that he couldn't take everything from me. He thought he could strip away our life together, but he didn't realize the value of everything I had built. Let him enjoy his moment of triumph. I'd show him what real strength looked like. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and careful planning. Brad's texts kept coming, each one more smug and condescending than the last. He thought he was winning, that he had me cornered, that I would fall apart. But I didn't. I had spent too many years building my life, my business, to let someone like him tear it all down in one fell swoop. The day of the divorce hearing arrived, and I walked into the courtroom with a quiet sense of confidence. Brad, of course, was there in his new designer jeans and his tight blazer, his midlife crisis now painfully apparent. He looked like a man trying desperately to convince the world that he was still young, still relevant. He sat beside his lawyer, his gaze flicking over to me with that smug look on his face. I could almost see the wheels turning in his head as he wondered if I was going to fall apart, if I would beg for him to reconsider. But I wasn't here to beg. I wasn't here to plead for a man who thought he could destroy me with a few cruel words and an empty bank account. I was here to protect what was mine. I had been preparing for this moment for months, gathering every piece of evidence I could find, every text message he had sent me, every receipt, every bank statement. Everything was organized, and nothing had been left to chance. My lawyer stood beside me, calm and composed as we presented our case. The judge was an older man, one who had seen his fair share of divorce cases. He didn't seem impressed by Brad's theatrics, especially as he listened to the evidence we presented. There were the texts where Brad boasted about emptying the joint account, the receipts for the hotel rooms he had booked for himself and Jessica, and the credit card fraud that was so blatant it was almost laughable. Brad thought he could cover his tracks, but I had seen the signs, and I had been careful. Brad's lawyer tried to argue that he had simply made some rash decisions, but the judge wasn't buying it. He turned to Brad and asked, "You admit to intentionally emptying the joint account and using shared credit cards to fund a trip with your girlfriend. Do you deny this?" Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing. "I was just trying to make a clean break," he muttered, but the damage was already done. My lawyer, ever composed, countered immediately. "My client didn't make rash decisions. She took careful steps to protect herself, her business, and her assets. She maintained strict separation between her personal and business finances, despite her husband's repeated requests to combine them." The judge seemed to agree. He reviewed the documents I had presented, the deed to the house, the business incorporation papers in my name alone, and the meticulous records I had kept of every penny I had earned and invested in my boutique. It was clear that Brad had no claim to any of it. He had never contributed financially to my business, and his reckless behavior had shown that he wasn't interested in doing so. Brad's face twisted with frustration as the judge ruled. All shared assets are frozen pending final dissolution. The judge said, Mr. Harrison is ordered to return any funds removed from the joint accounts within 24 hours. Brad looked like he might explode. But the judge didn't give him a chance. And I must remind you, Mr. Harrison, the court takes a very dim view of using shared credit cards to fund a vacation with your girlfriend. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Brad had thought he could take everything from me. But he hadn't counted on my preparation, my foresight, and my ability to protect what mattered most. As I left the courthouse, I saw Brad and his new girlfriend, Jessica, standing off to the side, their faces filled with disappointment. I couldn't help but think of how different their lives were going to be now. They had imagined a glamorous escape, but the reality was much harsher. The money they thought they could spend on luxuries was gone, and the man who thought he could take it all had been exposed for what he was. A man who had underestimated me. I didn't feel sorry for him. Not in the slightest. I had learned a long time ago that the only person responsible for my happiness was me. And as I drove home, a sense of peace settled over me. I had faced Brad's betrayal head-on. And I had won. I spent the rest of the day organizing the next steps for my boutique. I didn't need to think about Brad anymore. My business was thriving, and nothing was going to take that away from me. He might have tried to destroy everything, but in the end, he had only made me stronger. And that was the best revenge. The days following the divorce hearing were filled with a strange sense of finality. It was as though a chapter of my life had closed. And now I was free to write my own story. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely, knowing that Brad's betrayal, his lies, and his manipulation were behind me. But what followed wasn't just relief, it was the beginning of something much more profound. While Brad fumed and tried to piece together what was left of his shattered life, I focused on what I had always known to be important, my business. The boutique had been my dream, my passion, and now, it was thriving. The first few weeks after the divorce were busier than ever. I threw myself into work with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to build something bigger, something Brad never seemed to understand. My loyal customers, many of whom had seen me go through the ups and downs of my marriage, showed their support in ways I couldn't have imagined. There were days when the shop was bustling with women sharing their own stories of empowerment, of finding strength after betrayal. I didn't just have a boutique anymore, I had become a symbol of resilience. I started expanding my business in ways I hadn't even thought about before. I hired a few new employees, opened a website, and began to reach customers beyond the walls of my shop. It was exhilarating, and for the first time, I felt truly in control of my life. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Meanwhile, Brad's life seemed to be falling apart at the seams. His attempts to portray himself as a victim were quickly unraveling, and it didn't take long for his family to see through his lies. His sister, Amanda, called me one afternoon, her voice filled with regret. "Emma, I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry. I never realized how much he'd hurt you until we saw his texts. He was cruel, and I should have known better." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For months, I had blamed myself for not seeing the signs earlier, for not realizing the kind of man Brad had become. But hearing his family admit they had been deceived, too, was a strange sort of validation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I had been right all along. Still, I didn't feel anger toward them. Instead, I felt pity for Brad. The more he tried to salvage his life, the more he dug himself into a hole. I heard through mutual friends that he was struggling to pay bills, his job on the line after a series of poor decisions, and his so-called relationship with Jessica was nothing more than a fleeting distraction. She had already left him, apparently tired of his inability to keep up with the lifestyle he had promised her. The irony was not lost on me. While Brad floundered in his attempts to regain his former life, I was flourishing. My boutique had garnered local press attention, and people began asking me to speak at events about my experience as a woman in business. They were inspired by how I had not only survived the breakup but had used it as a springboard to achieve even greater success. Brad continued to send me angry texts, accusing me of destroying his life, of being vindictive. He would rant about how I was too focused on my little shop and not on the real things in life. But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I knew that the best way to show him the depth of his mistake was to simply keep moving forward. One day, a few weeks after the hearing, I received a strange text from Brad. "You think you've won, but you've lost everything that mattered. I took half of your life, and you'll never get it back." I smiled as I read it. He still didn't get it. He thought that money, possessions, and superficial success were what mattered. But I had learned something far more valuable during our marriage. The true measure of success wasn't in what you could take from others. It was in what you could build on your own. I had built something, and as I looked around my boutique, now bustling with customers and filled with the hum of success, I realized that this was only the beginning. My life, my business, my future, these were the things that truly mattered. Brad's words didn't sting anymore. Instead, they fueled my drive to prove that I was more than capable of achieving everything I had dreamed of. And so much more. As the days turned into weeks, I saw Brad's attempts to salvage his life grow more desperate. He tried online dating, but the women his age weren't interested. He had become a joke at work. His career stalling as HR launched an investigation into his inappropriate relationships with employees. All the while, I continued to expand my business, one successful step after another. I didn't need to tear Brad down to make myself feel better. He had already done that on his own. My success, my growth, and my independence were the best form of revenge. As the months passed, my life transformed in ways I had never imagined. The boutique I had started from scratch had blossomed into a thriving business, one that I could be proud of. I had expanded, hired new employees, and even started planning for a fourth location. The sense of fulfillment I had now was something I had never experienced before. Not even during my marriage. I had become my own success story, and every step forward was a reminder of how far I had come. Brad, on the other hand, had continued his downward spiral. His once promising career had been derailed by poor choices, and his relationships, including the one with Jessica, had crumbled. I heard through mutual friends that he had moved back in with his parents. His dreams of a glamorous life with Jessica nothing more than a distant memory. It was hard not to feel a quiet satisfaction, knowing that I had been right to trust myself and protect what was mine. I received an invitation to speak at a women's business conference. The topic wasn't divorce, betrayal, or hardship. It was about building and protecting a successful business. As I stood before the audience, sharing my story, I realized that the pain I had gone through had shaped me into the woman I was today, a strong, independent entrepreneur who knew her worth. Brad's final words to me, the cruel text he had sent, were now framed in my office, not as a reminder of my hurt, but as proof of how far I had come. Success, I had learned, was the best revenge. Thank you for reading. If you found my story inspiring, please subscribe to our channel to follow more life stories that remind us all of the power of resilience and strength.